So I will call to order the Thursday, May 27th, 2021 Policy and Education Subcommittee meeting. Our first order of business is the approval of minutes from May 6th, 2021. Any questions from the committee? Any questions, Sarah?
Well, I'm gonna have to abstain because I was absent that meeting too.
You weren't there. Okay.
It's gonna be a
So
tough vote.
procedurally, yeah. Do we need Tom to vote on that then procedurally?
Yeah, you need to probably do a motion to table or
Okay.
or move that item to the end of the meeting in case Tom's able to make it.
Let's try that. So we'll
Okay.
just skip right over that for now.
Gotta make
The
a
next
motion,
item,
or
sorry,
do we have to make a motion to move it to the end?
You should
do we
procedurally.
really?
I'll make a motion to move the minutes of the meeting to the end of the meeting.
All right, so moved. Want to second it?
Second.
We'll do a roll call vote. Sarah?
Aye.
And I'll say aye. Okay.
Good old Robert and his rules.
Oh, man. Real natural flow for the meeting. So the next item on our agenda is consideration of request Archdiocese of Boston to open new school, Lumen Verum Academy. So we received a very comprehensive document about this, but I'm assuming one of you two gentlemen on the administration side would like to tell us more about it.
I believe we have some of their representatives and the attendees.
Excellent.
Coming over.
Great.
Hi, thank you. This is Tom Carroll.
Hi, Mr. Carroll. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Carol,
you.
is Gina and Karen also with you?
Yep.
Yeah, Gina is supposed to sign on, and then Karen is, because she works at another school right now, will be signing on a little later.
Okay. I just had to bring them over from the attendees, so they are they're with us
Oh,
now.
okay, they're both on. Great.
Yeah.
So how would you like to proceed?
I was just going to ask the same question of the gentleman from our administration. Is there any particular process that we would typically follow, or?
Well, yeah, obviously, you've sent in a comprehensive document outlining the proposal, but it obviously is helpful if you can kind of just walk us through it. You speak in terms of blended learning, a better indication of exactly what that will be like, and then the salient points you think we should listen to this evening.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So first of all, as I'm the superintendent of schools for the Archdiocese of Boston. Joining me today are Gina Matthews, who's the Associate Superintendent for Academics, and also Karen Solano, who currently is the Director of Instruction at St. Paul's Choir School and is going to be the co-principal for academics for the new school. So as we come out of the pandemic, we're pretty optimistic about the future. And one of the things we've had on the boards to do, got delayed a little by what was going on with the pandemic, is we're creating the first fully new school that the Archdiocese has launched in more than a half century. So over the past year, we've learned a lot about the pluses and minuses of technology, as I'm sure the Braintree public school system did as well over the last year. And so what we're trying out is a blended learning academy. That means different things to different people. It's a lot of different ways to go about that. So we're seeking to combine what we view as the virtues of technology with the importance of the in-person interaction of students at the same time. So the way we've structured it is Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, the students will be delivered education virtually. And then on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and parents have to choose one or both days. They don't necessarily have to choose both days, but they're given the option of 2 in-person days. And then we have additional evening events that add another 3 hours in combination to their in-person activities. So on the in-person days, they start, because the Catholic school, with a Mass or what we call Eucharistic adoration. And then the rest of the day is a combination, depending on the week, of field trips, additional lectures, student clubs and activities, physical activities, including hikes, kayaking, and so forth. And then we have a number of unique features of the model. First of all, from a Catholic perspective, it's the only blended learning school that's Catholic in the country. We have a 9 to 5 school day, I used to run charter schools in New York, and we try to get as close to a 9 to 5 school day as possible to add to instructional time. We have 4 virtual days, as I mentioned, per week, and 2 in-person days. We have an extended school year, which is in the submission, that adds a bunch of days, 20 or so days to the typical calendar year. Even more if you go to both the Wednesday and Saturday, it's even more. We have dramatically smaller class size than typical Catholic schools. The class size range is 8 to 12 students. We also have substantially more professional development days than a typical Catholic school. And then we also have a focus on pushing as much instruction as possible into Socratic discussions rather than teachers standing in the front of the classroom and delivering lectures. We are reconceiving the concept of a teacher to be more of a curator rather than primarily a lecturer, by which I mean whenever an educational standard has to be covered, we're encouraging the teachers to consider what's the best way to deliver the information in a way that will be memorable and meaningful to the students. So if it's a lecture, it will be a lecture. If it's through the teacher developing a multimedia video, that might be the option. If it's getting a guest speaker to come in, or a film, or reading essays, whatever it might be, they're supposed to be much more flexible in terms of, instead of automatically going to the default of a lecture. We also, one of the virtues of virtual is the entire English speaking world becomes potentially an extended faculty. So we've already been able to get some pretty astonishing people to agree to that. So for example, George Weigel, who's the official biographer of St. John Paul II and knew him for about 30, 40 years, is going to be, we're teaching totalitarianism in the 20th century through the lens of St. John Paul II's life. In part because when he was in the seminary, it actually was an underground seminary because the Nazis were rounding up priests. And then you go to, obviously, the Nazis were replaced by the Soviet Union shortly after that. And then you also have kind of interesting dynamics to the life of JP2 in the sense that when he got elected Pope, there were revealed KGB telegrams that have since been made public that talk about their reaction to a Pope being somebody from behind the Iron Curtain. Separately, for about 700 years, there's been a Habsburg dynasty in Europe. Originally started out as, the emperor started out as the Holy Roman Emperor. And so we've got an agreement from Edward Habsburg, who's the ambassador to Hungary, from Hungary to the Vatican, has agreed to teach the Habsburg, what was a dynasty and an empire and now a monarchy, that portion of, depending how you count it, 500 to 700 years of European history. So we found when we're talking to people around the country that we think could teach interesting parts of this, they're very interested in participating. And so that becomes a big part of the model. While we're developing this, and you'll see in one of the second, in what we call the appendix, which was the second document we transmitted, which is, I think, 57 pages or so, understanding that your primary challenge under the statute is to determine whether the education we're providing is equivalent to the education that would be provided in a public school. A few context things. One, the state educational standards are not applicable to private schools. So that makes it a little tricky. And we also aren't subject to the state assessment regime either. But nonetheless, given your task is what it is, we then took quite a long time trying to crosswalk what our educational standards were to the Massachusetts educational standards, so that you could have a sense, although we don't have the same scope and sequence that the state does, but we tried wherever possible to indicate what we were covering, how it compared to what the state standards are. And I think that reveals, I think, pretty clearly that we provide a comparable educational experience for kids to somebody who would be in a school that's subject to the Massachusetts educational standards. A moment on governance and staffing, because we're Catholic schools are structured differently, obviously, than public schools. In the Archdiocese, there are 100 Catholic schools, 31,500 students. We have, counting faculty and staff, we have about 3,000 faculty members, about 1,200 staff members. The governance models varies by the type of school. This is what we call an RCAB related entity. RCAB, the acronym for Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. So what that means is it's an entity that is controlled by the Archdiocese, but is set up as a freestanding nonprofit. But the members of the corporation, anyone who's set up either official private corporation or nonprofit corporation, the bylaws stipulate who the members of the corporation are, which is essentially the controlling interest, and they have separate allocation of duties independent of the board of directors, the board of trustees of the school. In this case, the sole member is the Archdiocese of Boston, and the Archdiocese of Boston, unlike a public school board where the board members would be elected, here they're appointed by the Archdiocese of Boston. I'm the president of the nonprofit entity. I'm also the chairman of the board of trustees of the board of directors of Lumen Verum Academy. The school eventually will have a head of school, which is the model common in our high schools and many private high schools. And then, unlike most schools, we have two principals instead of one principal. So the reason for it, and they report to the head of school eventually. At the moment, they report to the president of the school, who is me. And then the ultimate authority in the school is the board of directors, unless the Archdiocese intervenes on some particular issue under the bylaws. The reason we have two co-principals is they're two separate sides of the house, so to speak. There's the academic side, which Karen Solano's in the charge of. That's the faculty. That's 5 academic teachers. That would look pretty much like you would in a public school, except some of them are certified, some not. Certification requirements don't apply to private schools. And then the other person is the co-principal for faith formation, which you obviously wouldn't have in a public school, and also student activities. So under that person are 2 campus ministers, or we call them ministers. They're not a minister like in a sense of being a priest or something like that, but basically they're in charge of the ministry of they have generally people with youth ministry backgrounds. And in the case of the 2 people we have that report to the co-principal for faith formation student activities, both of them have degrees, one from a seminary, the other has a degree in theology. So those people also supplement the academic side. And similarly, the academic teachers also work on the in-person days. So the guts of the academic program, and that's what you're judging is whether it's equivalent or not. It's those 5 academic teachers for the secular subjects. And then we have 2 campus ministers plus one of the co-principals that are also helping for the theology classes. Like any school, we have a manager, some position, they call it different, basically a manager of the finance and operations. And that person reports to the president right now, which is me. Eventually they would report to a head of school. So in the initial year, we're starting very small. There's so many different pieces of this that are new and different. Our view is for the first couple of years, we wanted to get the model to gel, to figure out. I found it in prior jobs, 10 different schools from scratch. So that gives me a lot of experience, but it also gives me a healthy dose of humility, and that things don't always play out in reality the way one thinks within one's mind. And so we want to, with the relatively small number of students, kind of perfect the model. The beauty of your process, which is that you have a review every year, it allows us to come back every year with whatever lessons we've learned and to come back to you with kind of suggestions on how we might look at things differently a year from now. We're starting with roughly 25 students. So to have 25 students and essentially 7 teachers and 2 co-principals and a president is a lot of staff. Obviously, in a normal Catholic school, we would have 1 teacher for 25 students. So we're overstaffed intentionally. In terms of physical space, which has been confusing to people as we enroll the school, there is no school building. So some of the criteria in the document you sent us are reviewing the school building to make sure there's no lead paint in it, that it's suitable for kids, it's handicap accessible and all of that stuff. So we don't have a school building because the instruction is virtual. And on the in-person days, they'll literally be all over the catchment area, I should say, for this school is the entire Archdiocese. So, which runs from Plymouth, Mass, up to the New Hampshire border and westward almost to Worcester. It's geographically the largest school district in the state. It's the second largest school district in terms of number of students. So, but in that space, we have, if kids are going to Eucharistic adoration or Mass, we obviously have hundreds of churches. We also, as superintendent, I have access to all of our school buildings. And then we also have access to space in churches, what they use for CCD or religious instruction. And we also have access to 2 seminaries as well. So the one thing the Catholic Church has is lots of real estate. So all of those buildings, whichever one we use, what we're going to do just for posterity is every space that we use, other than if we go to a museum or public museum or something like that, we won't keep records of whether they're inspected or not and stuff like that. But for all the spaces that we own, we will keep a running record of every space that we used and what their, copies of their fire inspections and, all the other certificates of occupancy and all that kind of stuff. So if anybody ever has a question, to make sure that in any building that the Archdiocese owns, mostly for our own legal reasons, we're keeping records of what shared space that our kids ever went into. So the other part of this is philosophically, the school is open source, by which nothing about it is proprietary. It's being set up in part because we think it's a way to test out a bunch of different approaches to education, but open source in the sense that we're not, other than the name, we're not copywriting or trademarking anything. And the goal is to share whatever we learn, the good, the bad, the ugly, with everybody, whether it's public schools or district schools or charter schools, private schools or Catholic schools or other religious schools. So, because I think a lot of what we'll learn by opening this school are lessons that could be applied more broadly to anybody involved in the educational field. In terms of admissions, a lot of people think private schools are super exclusive, and some of them are. We've made the decision, most of our private high schools have admissions exams that kids take. We are not doing any, we'll later on do, once somebody's admitted, we'll do placement exams to make sure they're placed in the right classes, but we won't do any admissions or entrance exam at all for the school. Students do not have to, even though it's a Catholic school, the position of the Archdiocese has always been that a person does not have to be Catholic to attend a Catholic school. So we don't care what your religion is. We don't care if you believe in God at all. Actually, we care, but I mean, it's not a criteria to attend the school. And we also don't screen for family configuration in any way. And so the tuition is, before discount, is $14,750 a year. The average for Archdiocesan high schools is just over 20,000. We work with families who can't pay that amount and we scholarship them. We haven't rejected anybody who couldn't pay on the basis of income. So that's kind of my overview. If you have questions, there's 3 of us here. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
One question I'd pose, you talk in terms of starting small, around 25 students. What would be your process for selecting those students? I would assume you get greater demand than 25.
Yeah, so the demand is actually suppressed in a sense by a couple factors. One is, I think after COVID, we have a lot of interest, but in terms of enrollment, after COVID, a lot of people are not looking for virtual. So the first cut is, I get conversations almost every day of people saying, could you do it as a bricks and mortar school and put it a reasonable driving distance from my house? So, and if I actually indulge all those requests, we'd be building like another 20 bricks and mortar schools. So people like a lot about the model, but we knew from the beginning it appeals to a particular kind of person, and not everybody's looking for it. And one of the reasons we got a big enrollment bump last year is because we were in person. So that's part of it. The other thing is some parents are having trouble dealing with a school that you can't visit and classrooms you can't visit and sit in, and a school that has no students, right? So all the things when you go to a private school is you want to see the facility, you want to talk to the parents, right? We have teachers they can meet, and you want to have your kids like follow somebody for a day. So we anticipate that we'll have a lot more. So we have a lot of wait and see people. And so I think we'll end up with a lot more people that enter in the second year. It takes a lot of bravery and a lot of faith to go into a school that doesn't exist. So when I did charter schools and I started brand new schools, we had an actual building they could see. And there's something about a building that just seems less fly by night, if you will. Even though we run another 100 schools, you know, it just, so that's the barrier on the enrollment side. That's why we don't have, you know, and even with charter schools where I had spectacular buildings, some were historic renovations, and I'd start off almost in every case with about 90 students. And then the next year, eventually 35% of the market were in schools that I created. But it always starts slow, and then the word of mouth takes over, and then it grows rapidly after that.
And my other question would relate to the way that you intend to deliver instruction. Obviously, it's technology heavy. What's the infrastructure? What are your platforms? What does that look like for a receiving student?
Yeah, Karen, if you want to jump in on that one.
Sure, happy to. Sorry, I apologize. My camera's off. I'm in the car. I'm driving my kids home from school. But so our learning platform, we are using a platform to deliver instruction called InSpace, which is a kind of a brand new platform that Tom was kind of speaking about educational institutions kind of learning from the pandemic experience and trying to create interfaces that were a little bit more dynamic and dynamic than Zoom. So it's a really wonderful interface for classroom discussion. As Tom mentioned, our primary mode of sort of in-person or virtual real-time instruction will be sort of Socratic dialogue. So we were looking for something that would sort of help our students mimic the feeling of being in a classroom and having a discussion, and InSpace really works well for that model. Of course, we will still have access to Zoom, which has different functionalities that are useful for other things. So we're going to have access to both of those modalities to provide instruction as well as meeting times for students one-on-one, all of that kind of stuff. For our learning management system, we're going to be using Canvas, which is kind of, in my opinion, from everything that we've looked at and having used it before as a teacher, kind of one of the premier learning platforms that educational institutions are using. Many of the private schools are using that as well as independent, as well as colleges and universities use that as well. And it's what we really love about it is that it's very integratable to a lot of different apps that educational platforms and apps that the students will be having access to. And then our kind of our student information system is the one that the diocese uses, which is FACS, the RenWeb system. That's where we're going to store sort of all the student information, medical records, grades, and all of that stuff. We're going to go through transcripts, and everything will be stored through the FACS system. Financial aid application process, all of that will be going through FACS.
And then Gina, maybe you could add about just kind of the platform for teacher evaluations that we use in the Archdiocese.
Absolutely. We use a platform called T-Eval, and it is based on the Kim Marshall method of mini observations. It has our teacher rubrics with 5 domains, including professional responsibility, Catholic identity, instruction, classroom management, and assessment. So what happens is the teachers go onto the platform during August PD days, first couple of weeks in September, they do a self-assessment. That self-assessment is then informative for their beginning of the year discussion with their principal to set their goals and how can the principal help them reach their goals. During the first semester, our principals are responsible for logging at least 2 mini observations on the platform. That is in addition to the daily walkthroughs. Mini observations last approximately 10 minutes. They are unannounced, and they serve the purpose of giving authentic feedback in real time. The feedback is given within 24 hours with a follow-up conversation. And that follow-up conversation, depending upon how those 10 minutes went, can be as formal or as informal as need be. Come mid-year, we strongly suggest, we all know how mid-year is with flu season, this year with COVID and vacations. But so we do strongly suggest that our teachers spend some time to do the mid-year assessment. And we do request that all principals sit down with their teachers at the mid-year to discuss how is it going? Let's take a look at your goals and how can we reach that finish line together? And I am here to support you. During second semester, our principals are responsible for logging at least 2 more mini observations. Again, those are over and above the daily walkthroughs, and logging those on the platform. They are pros, by the way. They are not checklists. They are actual pros. And having that follow-up discussion. From there, all principals as well as the teachers do a year-end assessment on that same rubric. That is used then for comparative purposes. How did one view their own growth, and how did the principal view the growth? For that end of the year discussion on, this is what I saw this year, this is where we're going. What are you thinking about for next year, if applicable, if they are not retiring or moving on, and perhaps suggesting some summer PD that would relate to the growth goals.
And then Gina, if you could just
in the
take
environment in which you'll find yourself, how do those walkthroughs work?
They work just as they did this year during our hybrid model and last spring, in which our principals, Karen, can jump on via Zoom. And our principals found that even in the hybrid model, because again, our schools were in person, but we did have some folks who were hybrid for whatever reason. Maybe they were exposed to COVID, or maybe they had some folks at home, especially early on in the pandemic, which, they wanted to stay remote. So our principals found that jumping into the classrooms via Zoom using our cameras and our technology was really beneficial during the COVID.
Yeah, Gene, do you want to spend a minute just on MAP is the other kind of system on the assessment side?
Yeah, so we use MAP and WEA testing for our schools. We have, this school is a 6 through 12 school, and our upper grades take the assessment in math, reading, and language arts, and they have the option to take it in science as well. We require our students to take it in the fall as well as in the spring, and we strongly urge our schools to take it in the winter. We have the 3 testing windows set up. In addition to the 3 testing windows, we do offer professional development throughout the year. For example, we have a professional development coming up in June, in which we have over 100 teachers signed up in June to do NWEA MAP testing data review. And what they're going to do, for example, in this PD, is they are going to actually use the data of the students who are going to them. So the current 3rd grade students will get the 2nd grade testing data from this year. Our NWEA MAP professionals will walk them through how to use the data to plan for September in the fall, so that they can leave the school with this data in hand, take that month of July to recoup and rest, and at the end of the July, really start that planning up with real data about the students who will be walking through their doors.
Great. Any other questions from the committee? Mr. Chafe, Mr. Devon, Dr. Hackett?
Yeah, if I may, through the chair. Mr. Carroll, I'm reading the pamphlet you gave us. It says 2 full days of engaged in-person activities. How does that work if you're grabbing people from Plymouth, say to Worcester and all over? Where is your meeting place?
Yeah, so we take a different approach on each day. So on each set day of the week. So on one day, there's centralized events. And so just because the number of schools we have regional drop-off points, and then we transport them. So for example, if they were doing the Freedom Trail in Boston, we don't expect all the parents to drive kids into Boston. So we're setting up, once our enrollment's finalized, we then set up regional drop-off points at other schools and or churches, and then we transport them in. On the other days, we use the regional kind of access to regional real estate to have regional activities in those days. So on one day, you have both days, you could theoretically have a short ride. And then in another day, there'd be a long ride, but you could basically, we can arrange the transportation and order carpools. So that's how it'll evolve eventually. If we end up with 25 kids, it's actually a little less complicated than that. It's easiest for it to work out the transportation system. And our faculty is also located across the Archdiocese.
Yeah, I get that now, but you're saying you want to grow eventually within, what year did you say, 2023 or something? You were talking to go from 6 to 12. Isn't that going to get a little harder to coordinate that without a central location?
Yeah, we don't go to 12, so we add a grade each year. So next year we would add 9th and the 22, 23, then 10th, 11th, 12th. So we won't be 12th grade till 2025, 26. And then with the
25,
Boston,
26.
right,
Go ahead.
with the enrollment across the Boston Archdiocese then being at 300 and maxing out at 350.
And to follow
So
up on
as
go ahead.
Go ahead, sir. No, I was going to
To
say, as
follow
the
up-
school gets bigger, the regional locations become more viable, right? If you have 25 kids and you split them up across 5, 6 regions, you don't have enough kids at each location. So that problem gets solved the bigger the school becomes. But you have more kids to transport on the single location days.
To
And
follow
then the
up on
parents
Mr.
also have the option of picking which day they take or to pick both. So some parents, depending on their ability to transport kids, could choose one day and not the other based on a matter of convenience.
To follow up on Mr. Lee's question, what is your selection process? I mean, if you're picking 25 kids from, say, Plymouth to Worcester to all over the Archdiocese area that covers out here in the East.
I mean, to
What
be
is-
honest,
how are you gonna pick them?
we've accepted every single kid who's applied. So we don't have the problem. We don't anticipate, we have enough staff. We could go much larger than 25, given the number of teachers we have. So we don't anticipate, given the way it's going, that any child will be not admitted. So that becomes an issue in future days, future times, what I did in the charter space and what we would do here too, because we do not have entrance exams. And the school's philosophical position is it's not going to screen kids, based on aptitude. We would do it on a first come, first serve basis.
Okay. It says your classroom screen time is going to be capped at 3 hours a day. What is your total screen time going to be capped at, or do you have a cap on that?
Yeah, we don't have total screen time cap because we don't control how long it takes a kid to do an assignment that might have a screen element involved in it. So when it comes to, and Karen can jump in after I'm finished, but when it comes to like books and stuff like that, we're giving people physical books rather than giving them like reading books on Kindles and stuff like that. So we're trying to minimize the screen time. We're also trying to have them. So we haven't explained the model. I don't know if Karen, do you want to explain the model in terms of how it works in terms of student prep time and homework? Because that will partly explain.
Sure,
issue here.
absolutely. So yeah, can you hear me? I'm sorry if I'm breaking up.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So we're definitely kind of taking very seriously the responsibility as teachers to teach students how to use technology as an educational tool, right? And to learn to use it prudently. And I see that as one of the benefits of our model, that we can really guide them through that process. So we are very committed to, getting actual textbooks in their hands, getting actual physical workbooks in their hands, teaching them, the basic skills of how to take notes by hand, all of that kind of stuff that you'd find in a traditional bricks and mortar setting. But we're also really working hard to kind of balance synchronous and asynchronous learning. So for instance, you might begin your class session with an online kind of mini lecture by your teacher, you'd hop off to do your worksheet offline, and then you might check in with your teacher at the last 5 minutes of class, and trying to make sure that there's a balance among all of the teachers in terms of what they are providing online and offline for the kids to do, and kind of really working hard at the beginning of the year when we start up with the students to kind of teach them that kind of prudent use of technology and balance between online learning and offline learning, and trying to get, again, using our in-person days to get as much of the materials that the kids are going to need for the upcoming week, the physical materials. So for instance, if they're going to be doing a science lab with their science teacher the next week, they'll have physical materials that, the kids will be distributed on the Wednesday and they can use them for the next week. So kind of making sure that they have access to both of those things. We also are trying to do a kind of flipped model of learning so that kids will be preparing for class before class, either through a video lecture prepared by the teacher or curated by the teacher, or a reading from a physical text that they'll have to read and prepare for class. So when they come to the virtual setting, it will be a very dynamic, interactive interface. It won't just be staring, sort of mindlessly at the screen for the period of time that they're learning, but it will be a dynamic and interactive engagement of a learning engagement with the students during those times. So we are trying to be very mindful of screen time, and also, again, mindful of our responsibility to teach kids how to use this really powerful educational tool responsibly.
We also have a different approach on the parent side, the parent engagement side, which is all the teachers, when they post their homework assignments, they're completely visible to parents at all times. So they know exactly what their kids are being taught. That's one part because of transparency, but it's also to begin conversations between the students and the parents about the materials, like what books they're reading. We're hoping parents will engage in some of the material. And then we also I just hired a person today to do this function. We have a person whose sole purpose is to, before dinner time, send a parent email explaining everything that their kid worked on that day. So if, I'm not trying to project onto other people's family, but if it goes like my house, the conversation goes roughly like this. What did you do today? Nothing. With school interest? Oh, it was boring again, or something like that, right? And so, and then you're kind of off to the races, and and particularly if you're paying tuition, like I'm paying all this money and you're bored, then maybe I should send you to a different school. So what we're trying to do is to get the parents to know what the kids are saying, so that, and to coach the parents that when they get to dinner time, instead of asking an open-ended question that could lead to nightly frustration, that they know exactly what the kid had worked on, specifically that child, instead of a general update on the school. So if they had a guest speaker, I joked to the cardinal that, because he's actually very close with the Pope. So I said, well, why don't we get the Pope to Zoom in, right? Or to come in on InSpace. And then when the kid says to his mom, like, what did you do today? Oh, nothing. And she says, well, I saw that you were talking to the Pope today and your teacher sent me a picture. So like, what does it take to get you excited, kid? So we're trying to start that engagement. We're trying to push all the homework into the day. One of the reasons we expanded the day is to have these student prep periods before each discussion group. So you don't have a kid studying on a Saturday and then, trying to remember it when they have a discussion on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. But the idea is, and we have a homework block as well, which, lots of schools have, but the hope is a lot of the work is done during the school day. So when you roll around to the family dinner, you could have these meaningful conversations among parents. And frankly, if we could get parents and kids to actually be talking to each other instead of having these ridiculous conversations at night. And then afterwards, then the student going to our school could actually help the other kids in the family out, rather than the kids having yet another kid that they have to badger to do their homework. So that's the aspiration. That could be one of the things where we get mugged by reality, but that's what we're trying to achieve with the parents.
And a couple of final questions. How many of these schools do you are up and running in the area now?
That like this?
Yeah.
Oh, none. There's literally not a school like it in the entire country.
So you're going to be the
So,
test
yeah.
model.
Right.
And
There are fully virtual. So there were about 6 dioceses that last year, all the schools outside of California where they were not allowed to, Catholic schools across the whole country were open last year. But some schools experimented with doing a virtual school. Most of those didn't work out so well. And I think it didn't work. Like one in Arlington, for example, ended up closing at the end of the year. And I think the reason is because they didn't do an in-person piece. And so I think the in-person part, the socialization piece is really important. And so that's why we've dedicated roughly 19 hours a week to kind of the social interaction of students.
Are there any plans on in the future brick and mortar school? Because I know St. Francis up here is leasing out their building at their academy. I was just wondering if their lease gets up, are you guys planning on moving in there too?
No, we're not planning on. You mean for this school?
Yeah, for this school.
Yeah, we would not move into the building in the sense of being a permanent tenant. Whether any facility that the Archdiocese owns that is available, depending on where we're doing the event, we might consider it. But if we want to do an event like just south of Boston, we have probably like 15 different options of where we could do the event. So I couldn't tell you in advance whether we would use that. If it's what the Archdiocese does with space when the school closes, they generally don't sell property, they lease it out. So if a school is in there, like there's also a school in Weymouth, St. Jerome's, that was closed, same situation. They're in there for this year. A lot of times districts rent our space while they're doing construction to have like swing space. And we've been pretty cooperative across the Archdiocese in working out arrangements with public school districts. But after that, they're generally looking for a permanent tenant. And if they get a permanent tenant, that trumps. And so if I wanted to use it, like St. Jerome's, for example, has a really nice basketball court, right? So if I wanted to use it, I could use it as long as it was kind of it had not been leased by somebody. But the second they get a deal, that would my option to use that space would close. So that's why we're not locking into a specific location for the in-person day activities. And a lot of the in-person activities are what in a normal school you would call a field trip. So like if we're going to the Boston Science Museum, we don't need a school facility to do that. Or if we're going on a hike, obviously we're going to a mountain, we're not going to a school facility. So in a narrow, I can't answer the question whether we would ever use that specific space at any particular time.
Thank you.
The other thing I'll just mention, nobody's asked, but we have 0 applications from Braintree at the moment. So the financial impact on the school district at the moment, I can't say there wouldn't be one, but if we have 25 kids across, an archdiocese this large, it would be a pretty minimal impact, if any. But at the moment, the financial impact is exactly 0.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the questions. Solon, were you going to ask a question?
I'm sorry. I was just having some technical difficulty over here with my setup. Mr. Devon, any questions from you?
Madam Chair, no. I think the package they had was pretty comprehensive. And you go online and you can kind of research more than a few things that point out what they're trying to do. This time I'm fine. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Yeah, so like Mr. Devon said, thank you for all the material that you provided. It was very comprehensive. You answered a couple of the questions that I had written down in terms of admission and tuition and managing geography. It was interesting to me just sort of that a lot of the complaints that we heard this year as a public school was that all the Catholic schools are open and in person. So it was interesting to me to see that your model was largely virtual. And I think you may have alluded to, did you start the planning process for this school prior to COVID then?
No, we actually started in the midst of COVID by the early end of it. But yeah, so when COVID hit, and this happened to every school district, in the country, it just overwhelmed everything. And then from the church perspective, the financial impact of the economic crisis affected church attendance, collections, philanthropy, tuition collection. So it was kind of like an all hands on deck for the whole year. So we thought about it, but we didn't frankly have the bandwidth to think about it seriously until things calmed down. And if you look at it from the Archdiocese perspective, this is almost, I've been preaching the virtues of in-person instruction for the past year. So a lot of people why are you opening a blended learning school, right? And the answer is, I think, you know, I think 95% of the people want in person. That's why we have 100 in-person schools, and we have one that's not. And so it allows us to reach our markets. We're getting a lot of homeschoolers who find it increasingly that the older your kids are, the more difficult it is for a mom or a dad to actually competently do homeschooling, because the elementary stuff's pretty easy. But once you get in 6th, 7th grade, certainly high school grades, you have to, I joke, since Leonardo da Vinci, nobody's been equally brilliant in every single academic subject. And so kind of the conceit of homeschooling in the upper grades is that you actually do it as well as a team of teachers. And I think that's a little dubious. So our pitch to them is, you've done the elementary thing, you can pass the baton to us and we'll kind of take it from here. Those families like that the kids are at home because they're homeschoolers, they want their kids kind of in proximity. We also have a number of people who like certain Catholic schools, but they don't live close enough to get to them. And so they're what we call Catholic school deserts, which is 75% of our school buildings, because they were all built in the 50s and 60s and earlier, some back in the 1800s. They were where the Catholics were 50 plus years ago. 75% of the Catholic, so within Route 128, east of 128 are 75% of the buildings. 75% of the Catholics are west of Route 128. So we have a lot of Catholics that would like to go to Catholic school, but there's no Catholic education within a reasonable distance. And we don't have enough money for a variety of reasons to be planting brand new schools at, $50 million, $70 million a pop all over the Archdiocese. Those days are pretty much behind us. So this is a relatively economic way to reach people that are kind of gaps in our market in terms of the availability of a Catholic education. So that was the thinking behind it. So I think forever, it will always be the case that most kids want to be in person and most kids don't. The third market, I'll just close with this, is, which we didn't expect to be a big thing, but it's turning into a big thing, is particularly in the lower grades. High schools are generally the 9 and up are more flexible. But the assumption of the elementary side of this is every kid who's in a grade is in the same aptitude in every single academic subject. And so the teachers have the challenge of really gifted kids and kids that are remedial all in the same class. You're kind of forced to pitch it to the middle. That holds back and frankly bores the really advanced kids. And the other kids aren't getting the concentrated remediation that they need in that particular classroom. So with the virtual classroom, because we don't have to worry about kids bumping into each other, like a classroom doesn't have to be empty before kids can move into it. We can admit a 6th grader and they could be taking 8th grade math, 7th grade, science. They could be placed lower in some other subject. And so we can kind of level everything and then sort the kids by ability level, not overall by their grade, but by their actual aptitude in individual subjects. So kids who are kind of asynchronous in the sense that we've found a lot of kids who are super off the charts in 1 or 2 subjects, but they're really weak in other subjects. And so our model actually works really well for those kids that are kind of out of sync with themselves. And so a lot of parents with kids like that have found it to be really appealing. So that's kind of a surprise market, kids that are gifted and talented and remedial at the same time.
I feel like you may have peeked at my notes because my other two questions were how leveling, if you have, these sort of smaller classrooms, and who this model is a good fit for. So I think you more than adequately answered both of those questions. So thank you.
We're also looking at special ed too. We have an interesting case, somebody applied today because some kids who are overstimulated in a larger classroom, that being in their comfortable setting in their home and being like one person on a screen is actually easier for them to handle than kind of the constant agitation of everybody around them. Because depending on what their situation is, for some kids that totally spins them up. So we're having a conversation with the family now, whether they think the kid this actually will work the way they're thinking will work, but we're open to figuring those kind of market niches as well, that there might be kids that just aren't that bricks and mortar just doesn't work for them for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And we don't care whatever their aptitude is or isn't, that doesn't make a difference to us. So that's the social mission of the school, is to take literally anybody that we can serve.
So even kids with significant, learning disabilities or special education needs,
Yeah,
then
so
how?
yeah, so what we're talking about is we have to find needs that would work for financing reasons, right? So I'm already raising a substantial amount of money. You imagine I have that many teachers and I have tuition for 25 people, right? The math of this, is what it is. But the Archdiocese has raised a lot of money specifically around education that is kind of taking care of that. So as we get larger, our ability to handle kind of the more intense special ed cases grows. Just like in a district, I know in New York, where I'm from, often they'll move kids by special ed designation based on specialties that particular schools handle. Because even though a district's large, individual schools can be small and they don't have the capacity to handle every single special ed situation that arises. So we have to hit a certain scale. The Archdiocese also runs 2 schools that handle severely disabled kids, like a Down syndrome kid, for example. We actually have, the Archdiocese at great expense runs 2 special education schools that handle that, kind of the people that need, in a sense, like one-on-one, care. So we're
Okay.
trying to figure out, as we go along and as parents express interest, anyone who's got some, complications, we're trying to figure out how we can handle it and when we can handle it. And to be careful that we don't overpromise. And then we have to, and it also affects, it's a little complicated on the special ed stuff too, because we have to, where they live dictates where they get the special ed services. So there's a little complexity there. Because there's, in the Archdiocese, there's over 140 school districts. So you can imagine the challenge we have dealing with that many different school districts to coordinate special ed services. But that's another reason to start small, bite off what we think we can do well, and then just keep expanding. But from a social commitment perspective, we would love to handle a pretty wide array of students that required special ed services.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions from any of our meeting attendees here?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. So procedurally, I think what we need to do, and Dr. Hackett and Mr. Lee, please correct me, is recommend moving the approval of this school to the full committee. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. So I'd
I'll
like
make a motion to
to.
do so, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Second,
All right. You guys are one step ahead. So we'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
aye.
and I vote aye. So we'll bring the recommendation to the full school committee at our next available meeting to discuss the approval of the school. So
I
thank
have
you
a
so
quick
much for
question.
coming to our meeting.
Thank you.
And,
Just a quick question.
Please.
Do you want us at the next meetings, or is this the only in-person, only meeting at which we participate?
I actually think it would be helpful if you don't mind. We can get the date to you. All 3 of you, I think, don't necessarily have to be there, but I think it would be great if there are some questions from the larger committee. We'll make sure that they avail themselves of all the material that you shared and are prepared for it. But I think it would be great to hear from you as well.
Okay,
You-
we'd be
you
happy
get-
to participate.
And you definitely don't need to go to this level of detail with a full committee.
Right.
The subcommittee will provide that recommendation to the full committee, and they'll kind of give some highlights of your presentation. But to Ms. Dolan's point, I do think it'd be good for them to see you and to hear your, and if they have any questions.
Okay, excellent.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for your time. I know it's a lot of time for you to spend on a school that doesn't have any students coming out of Braintree, but it's just the quirky way state law works. But thank you. Appreciate the thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye.
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 Okay. So I think we've spent quite a bit of time as a committee this evening, and the other items on our agenda, I think, can be pushed to our next meeting. They are, sorry, let me scroll back up in the document.
Excuse me, Ms. Chair.
Yes,
We got to vote on the minutes of the meeting.
yes.
We'll
Yep.
table that towards the end.
Yep. So just to conclude my thought, we were going to talk about the online code of conduct and any other MASC boilerplate policies. So we will take that up at our next meeting. So to Mr. Chase's point, we are looking for approval of the minutes from May 6th. Mr. Devon, did you have any questions about those minutes?
No, Madam Chair, I'm fine with that. I'll make a motion to accept them as written.
Okay, I'll second it. We'll do our roll call vote. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe, just for formality.
Abstaining.
Okay, and I'll vote aye. So those are approved as written.
Madam Chair, may I make a motion that we table the remainder of our agenda for this evening?
Thank you. So moved.
Second.
So we'll take a roll call vote on that. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
Aye.
and I'll vote aye. So we'll take that up at our next meeting. I did make some amendments to that policy based on our last discussion. Mr. Lee gave me some feedback, so we'll have a bit of a tighter draft to present to you for discussion at our next meeting. Anything else anybody wants to discuss or bring up?
All set, Madam Chair.
I'm all
All
set.
right. How about one more motion?
Motion to adjourn?
All right.
Second.
All right. We'll take our roll call vote. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
Aye.
and I will vote aye. So thanks, everybody.
All right,
Thank you
have a
very
good
much,
night,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.